Emily Carter hummed softly as she polished the crystals of the immense chandelier in the Blackwood estate. It was a strange, age-old tune, one that seemed to bubble up from some deep place within her. A song she didn't remember learning. A song that had simply existed in her soul for as long as she could remember. Her fingers glided over the crystal as the melody flowed gently from her lips. Notes that rose and fell like waves of a centuries-old ocean. A tune no radio station had ever played. A tune no teacher had ever taught. A tune that seemed older than time itself. If you've ever had a melody stuck in your head and had no idea where it came from, pay attention to this story, because some songs aren't learned. They're remembered. Richard Blackwood, 38 years old, CEO of one of the largest hotel empires in the United States, descended the marble staircase of the estate that had belonged to his family for generations. He hadn't smiled in 3 years, not since his wife died in a car accident. 3 years of soulless meetings, 3 years of empty nights, 3 years of a silence that weighed more than any noise. But that October morning, something happened that would change everything. Midway down the third step, Richard froze. His feet simply stopped obeying. His hand gripped the railing so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His heart leaped as if he'd seen a ghost. Because in a way, he had. That melody. That damned melody that the new housekeeper hummed as she cleaned the crystals. It was the same melody that Richard had heard in his dreams since he was 5 years old. The same melody that woke him in the middle of the night, covered in sweat and tears, without knowing why. The same melody he had spent his entire life trying to find in records, on the radio, in music libraries, anywhere. A melody that didn't exist, a melody that had died back in 1820. Impossible, his mind screamed. Completely impossible. Emily continued singing, oblivious to the earthquake she was causing in the man standing on the stairs. Her notes filled the immense hall of the estate, echoing off the walls covered in antique portraits, gliding over furniture worth more than she would ever possess in her entire life. She was just a housekeeper, an orphan who grew up in Grimshaw Orphanage in the outskirts of New Orleans, a 28-year-old woman who had taken the job because her little brother, Ethan, just 8 years old, was dying of leukemia, and the treatments cost more than she could imagine. Emily had nothing, no past, no family besides Ethan, no future beyond the hope of keeping him alive for one more day. All she had was her voice, and that strange melody she'd been singing for as long as she could remember. Richard descended the rest of the staircase in silence. His steps were calculated, like those of a predator approaching something he couldn't explain. Each step was a battle between the reason that said it was impossible and the heart that screamed that he'd finally found something he'd been searching for decades. He stopped 10 feet from Emily. She was facing away, still singing, her arms stretched to reach the highest crystals of the chandelier. The simple housekeeper's uniform didn't hide the natural elegance of her movements. There was something about her, something that transcended the poverty of her clothes and the simplicity of her role. There was something real, something ancient, something familiar, and then she turned. Emily's eyes met Richard's, and the world stopped. It wasn't a metaphorical pause. The air itself seemed to freeze between them. The crystals of the chandelier stopped tinkling. The antique clock on the wall seemed to silence its ticking. For a moment that lasted an eternity and a second at the same time. There were only 2 pairs of eyes recognizing each other across 200 years of distance. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Something she'd never felt before. As if her entire body was vibrating on a frequency she didn't know, but that felt terribly familiar. Richard felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. Those eyes, he knew those eyes. Not from that morning, not from some photo. He knew those eyes from a place his conscious mind couldn't access, but that his soul recognized instantly. "Where did you learn that song?" he asked, his voice hoarse, almost broken. Emily blinked. snapping out of the trance. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quickly, lowering her eyes as a housekeeper should before her employer. "I know I shouldn't sing while I work. It won't happen again." She started to turn back to the crystals, but Richard grabbed her arm. The touch was like a lightning bolt through both of their bodies. Emily gasped. Richard released the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I didn't ask if you should sing," he said, and now there was something desperate in his voice. "I asked where you learned that song. That specific song you were singing just now." Emily frowned, genuinely confused. "I don't know, sir. It's always been in my head. For as long as I can remember. At the orphanage, the nuns thought it was strange because I sang it since I was a baby, but no one ever knew where it came from." Richard dropped her arm as if burned. His eyes were wide. The expression of a man seeing the impossible materialize before him. "You're lying," he said, but there was no accusation in his voice, only despair. "You have to be lying." "I swear I'm not, sir." Emily placed her hand on her chest, over the heart that was beating uncontrollably without her understanding why. "I never learned that song. It's simply in me, as if I were born with it." Richard took a step back, then another. He needed air. He needed to think. He needed some rational explanation for what was happening. Because that song didn't exist anywhere in the world, he knew it. He'd spent 33 years of his life looking. He'd hired researchers, consulted ethnomusicologists, scoured archives of folk music from every country in Latin America and Europe. Nothing. The melody he'd heard in his dreams since he was 5 years old didn't exist in any known record of humanity. And now a housekeeper he'd hired just 3 days ago was singing that same melody as if it were the most natural thing in the world. There are coincidences in life. There are extraordinary flukes. But this transcended any explanation that the rational mind could offer. If you're still with me and have ever felt an inexplicable connection with something or someone, leave a comment, because this story is just beginning. Emily watched her employer walk away down the hallway without another word. She stood there, frozen, her hand still pressed against her chest, feeling her heart pounding against her ribs. What had just happened? Why had he reacted that way? Why did his touch on her arm feel like coming home? For the first time in her life, she shook her head, trying to push away the strange thoughts. She had work to do. She had a sick little brother at home, waiting for her to bring money for another round of chemotherapy. She didn't have time for mysteries, or for the strange way the millionaire had looked at her. But when she went back to polishing the crystal, she noticed her hands were trembling. And when she tried to hum the haunting melody that always accompanied her, she found that her voice had vanished, as if the music had hidden itself, somewhere deep within her soul, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Richard Blackwood locked himself in his study on the second floor of the Blackwood estate. It was an immense room, with walls lined with books, and a window that overlooked the impeccably manicured gardens of the property. He sat down in the leather armchair that had belonged to his grandfather and closed his eyes. The melody was there, as it always had been, dancing in his mind like a flame that refused to be extinguished. But now there was something more. Now there was a face associated with the music, the face of a poor housekeeper who barely knew where she came from. He needed to discover the truth. Richard picked up the phone and called the private investigator he used for corporate matters. "I want everything on a woman named Emily Carter," he said without preamble. "Where she was born, where she grew up. Any detail you can find, and I want it yesterday." While he waited, he opened the locked drawer of his desk. Inside, along with important documents and a framed photo of his late wife, was a worn notebook. He picked it up with hands that were still trembling slightly and opened it to the first page. It was handwritten sheet music, decades of attempts to transcribe the melody from his dreams. He wasn't a musician. He didn't know how to read music properly, but he had spent years trying to capture on paper what he heard in his mind. The notes were imperfect, approximated, but they were there. And now, he had someone who could sing them perfectly. In the following days, Richard observed Emily from afar. He couldn't bring himself to approach her again, not after that first encounter that had shaken everything he believed in. But he couldn't ignore her either. She worked hard, harder than any housekeeper he had ever had. She arrived at 6 in the morning and didn't leave until 10 at night. She cleaned every corner of the mansion, with an almost obsessive dedication. And sometimes, when she thought no one was listening, she would hum again. Always the same melody. Always that same impossible song. Richard found himself waiting for those moments. He would hide behind doors, or pretend to read in his office with the door ajar, just to hear her sing. Each note was a stab of recognition in his soul. Each chorus was a confirmation of something he couldn't explain. On the 5th day, the private investigator sent his report. Emily Carter was born in unknown circumstances and was left on the doorstep of Grimshaw Orphanage in the outskirts of New Orleans when she was approximately 2 months old. There was no record of her biological parents, no original birth certificate. She simply appeared one October night, wrapped in an old blanket, with a peculiar birthmark on her neck. Richard stopped reading. A birthmark on her neck. Something about that information made his blood run cold. He continued reading. Emily grew up in the orphanage until she was 18, when she left to work. She held various low-skilled jobs. 2 years ago, she assumed guardianship of Ethan Carter, a boy who arrived at the same orphanage as a baby, and whom Emily has treated as a brother ever since. Ethan was diagnosed with leukemia 8 months ago. The costs of treatment have consumed all of Emily's savings. She took the job at the Blackwood estate because it paid 3 times more than any other job she could get. Richard closed the report. There was nothing there that explained the music, nothing that connected that unknown orphan to the melody that had haunted his dreams for over 3 decades. But there was the birthmark, and there was something else. Something the report didn't mention, but that Richard felt in every fiber of his being. A connection, a familiarity, a sense that he knew that woman from somewhere much deeper than conscious memory could reach. The next morning, Richard made a decision. He needed to see Emily's birthmark. He didn't know why. He couldn't explain the urgency he felt, but he knew that that mark was important, crucial, maybe the missing piece of a puzzle he didn't even know he was assembling. He found her in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. The sun streamed through the window, illuminating her profile in a way that made Richard's heart skip a beat. She was turned away from him, her hair pulled back in a bun that left her neck exposed. And there it was, the birthmark, a dark and elongated mark that partially encircled the left side of her neck, a mark that didn't look natural, a mark that looked almost as if someone had left an impression there, a mark that bore a terrible resemblance to the shape of a rope. Richard had to lean against the doorframe to keep from falling, because he knew that mark, not from this life, from another, from a long time ago, from 200 years away, from a time when ropes were used to hang men who dared to love who they shouldn't. And suddenly, like a tsunami of memories that weren't his, but felt completely true, Richard saw. He saw a stone square under a scorching sun. He saw a screaming crowd. He saw a blindfolded man being dragged to the scaffold. He saw a woman running through the crowd, shouting a name he couldn't hear. He saw the rope being placed around the man's neck. He saw the woman being held back by guards as she wept desperately. And then he saw the woman's face, the same face that was now before him in the kitchen, the face of Emily Carter. The face of someone he loved 200 years ago, the face of someone for whom he died. The mark on her neck wasn't just any birthmark. It was the impression of the rope that killed him, transferred through the centuries, through the lives, as proof of a connection that not even death could extinguish. Richard let out a strangled sound. Emily spun around, startled, and found him as white as a ghost, leaning against the doorway there, looking at her as if he were seeing something impossible. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, dropping the spoon and rushing to him. Are you all right? Do you need water? A doctor?" Richard looked into her eyes. The same eyes from 200 years ago. The same eyes that were the last thing he saw before the rope tightened around his neck. The same eyes that promised to find him in every life, no matter how long it took. "Emily," he whispered, and his voice was laden with 2 centuries of longing. "How long have you been looking for me?" She frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" But before he could answer, before he could try to explain the unexplainable, his knees buckled. Richard Blackwood, the man who hadn't cried in 3 years, collapsed onto the kitchen floor of his own estate, sobbing like a child, clutching at the hem of the uniform of a housekeeper he had known for 2 centuries. And Emily, without understanding why, without being able to explain what moved her, knelt beside him and began to hum the same haunting melody, the same age-old tune, the song she had carried in her soul since she was born, the song he composed for her in 1820, the song for which he was killed, the song she promised to sing in every life until he recognized her again. And finally, after 200 years, he recognized her. This story is just beginning, but before we continue, I need you to do something. If you've ever felt an inexplicable connection with someone, a sense that you know a person you've only just met, leave a comment sharing your experience, because what comes next will make you question everything you believe about life, death, and the power of a simple song. Emily didn't know how long she stayed there, kneeling on the cold kitchen floor, humming to a man who was crying in her arms. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to have lost all meaning in that space between them. When Richard finally stopped crying, he pulled away slowly. His eyes were red, his face stained with tears. But there was something different about him now, something that wasn't there before. A light, a hope, an inexplicable certainty. "I need to show you something," he said, standing up with difficulty. "Will you come with me?" Emily hesitated. Everything about this situation was strange. A millionaire boss crying on the floor while she sang to him? That didn't make sense in any universe she knew. But there was something stronger than reason pulling her. Something that made her want to follow this man wherever he went. Something that said she had waited her whole life for this moment without even knowing it. She nodded. Richard guided her through corridors she hadn't yet seen in the Blackwood estate. They passed through rooms filled with antiques, through galleries of dusty portraits, down stairs that descended further and further into the depths of the property. Finally, they reached a massive oak door that looked older than the rest of the house. Richard took a key from a chain he wore around his neck, a key that Emily realized he always wore, hidden under his shirt. "This part of the house is older than the estate itself," he explained as he turned the key in the rusted lock. "It was built on the ruins of a colonial property from 1820. My family has preserved it exactly as it was." The door opened with a creak that echoed through the dark space beyond. Richard flipped an antique switch, and dim lights illuminated what appeared to be an underground hall. Emily gasped. In the center of the hall, covered by a thin layer of dust, was a grand piano. But it wasn't just any piano. It was a museum piece, clearly from another era, with mother-of-pearl and gold details that gleamed even in the dim light. And next to the piano, resting on an equally ancient easel, was a portrait. Emily felt her legs weaken when she saw the portrait. It was her. Or rather, it was someone who looked exactly like her. A woman in an elaborate dress, typical of the early 19th century, with the same eyes, the same face shape, the same expression. And next to this woman, holding her hand with evident devotion, was a man, a blind man, his eyes covered by a silk band, but whose face was unmistakably familiar. A face that Emily saw every day in business newspapers, a face that belonged to the man standing beside her in that basement, Richard Blackwood, or whoever he had been 200 years ago. "How?" she managed to whisper. "How is this possible?" Richard approached the portrait and touched the frame with reverence. "I found this when I was 18, he said. "It was hidden behind a false wall in this basement, along with the piano, and along with this." He went to a dusty table in the corner of the hall and picked something up. When he returned, Emily saw that it was a stack of papers yellowed with age. "Sheet music," he explained, handing the papers to her with trembling hands. "The only copy that exists in the world, written in 1820 by a blind composer who was executed for bewitching the daughter of the governor, the daughter who threw herself from the tower when she heard the bells announcing his death." Emily took the sheet music. The notes danced before her eyes, but she didn't know how to read music. However, even without knowing, she recognized it. Every note, every pause, every variation. It was her music. The music that had always been inside her. And then she saw the dedication, written in an elaborate script on the first page. "For my princess who sings in the darkness, your blind composer who only sees with his ears. May this song be our vow. In this life and in all those to come, until we meet again." Emily didn't realize she was crying until the tears fell onto the ancient pages. She wiped them away quickly, afraid of damaging something so precious, but they kept coming. "I dream about this," she said, and her voice was a broken whisper. "Since I can remember, I dream about a tower, about bells, about a man who can't see me but who knows me better than anyone. I dream about a fall, about wind, about the end. And then I wake up singing this song and I've never understood why." Richard approached her, slowly, as if she were a dream that could disappear at any moment. "I dream about the same thing," he said. "About the square, about the rope, about a woman who screams my name as I die. And then I wake up hearing this song and I spend the whole day trying to remember where it came from." Their eyes met again. And this time, there was no confusion. There was no doubt. There was only recognition. Pure, absolute, and devastating. "You promised me," Richard said, and now there was centuries of emotion in his voice. "The last night before they took me. You said you'd sing this song in every life until I found you, until I recognized you. You said it didn't matter how many lives it took." Emily felt something inside her open, like a door that had been locked for 200 years finally giving way. "And you promised me," she replied, and the words came from somewhere that wasn't her conscious memory. "You said you'd look for me in every face, that you'd listen to every voice, that you'd follow every melody, until you found me again." For a moment, the two just stared at each other. The weight of 200 years of searching hung between them, the relief of finally finding what they'd always been looking for. And then Richard did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He smiled. A true smile that lit up his face and transformed the cold, distant man into someone completely different. "I found you," he said simply. Emily smiled back through her tears. "You found me." But this was only the beginning. Because proofs needed to be verified, doubts needed to be dispelled, and there was much more buried in that basement, in that estate, in that 200-year history than either of them could imagine. The piano still waited to be played for the first time in 2 centuries, and when Emily finally sat before it, when her fingers that had never learned to play found the time-worn keys, the world would discover that some connections are too strong for death to destroy. But that's a story for another time. For now, 2 hearts that had searched for each other for 200 years were finally beating in the same rhythm, in the same place, in the same life. And that, in itself, was a miracle. But Richard, despite everything that had happened, was a businessman, a man of proof, a man who needed evidence before fully accepting anything, even when his heart had already decided. In the following days, he hired historians, researchers specializing in genealogy, experts in New Orleans colonial art. Each was given a specific task, and none knew what the others were investigating. Meanwhile, Emily continued working. She didn't know what to do with all of this. The revelation in the basement had turned her world upside down. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw flashes of images that weren't hers but felt completely real. A stone tower, secret gardens, a man's hands on the keys of an antique piano, a blindfold that she gently pushed aside to see two lightless eyes that still saw her better than anyone with perfect vision. She tried to keep her distance from Richard. He was her boss. She was just a housekeeper. It didn't matter what they had been 200 years ago. The social gulf between them in their present lives was insurmountable, but fate apparently had other plans. On the third night after the basement revelation, Emily woke up screaming. She was covered in cold sweat, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would explode. The dream had been more vivid than ever. She was in the tower, at the top, the wind whipping her face. Below, the bells were ringing. A crowd was dispersing after witnessing something horrible. And she knew in her soul, that he was dead, that the rope had done its work, that she would never hear his music again. And then, in the dream, she had jumped. Emily got out of the small bed in the room she occupied at the back of the estate. Her legs trembled as she walked down the dark hallway. She didn't know where she was going. Her feet were guiding her as if they had a will of their own. When she realized it, she was standing in front of the basement door. The door was ajar. A faint light was coming from inside. Emily descended the stone steps, her heart in her throat. With each step, the music became clearer. Someone was playing the 1820 piano. Someone was playing her song. When she reached the underground room, she found Richard sitting at the old instrument. He was playing with his eyes closed, his fingers moving across the keys with a confidence that didn't match someone who, he himself had said, wasn't a musician. But that wasn't the only thing that made Emily stop in the middle of the room, unable to move. Richard was wearing a blindfold over his eyes, a silk band that he had found along with the other artifacts in the basement, the same band the blind man wore in the portrait, and he was playing perfectly. Every note, every pause, every nuance of the melody that Emily carried in her soul. He played as if he had practiced for years, as if that music was as much a part of him as it was of her. Richard stopped playing when he sensed her presence. He didn't need to see to know she was there, just as he didn't need to have learned to play the piano to be able to do it when he put on that blindfold. "I don't know how to play the piano," he said, his voice hoarse. "Never learned. But when I put on this blindfold, my fingers know exactly what to do, as if someone else is guiding me." Emily approached slowly. "You were dreaming about it too, weren't you? The tower, the bells, the fall." Richard took off the blindfold. His eyes were red from crying. "I saw you fall," he said. "In the dream. I was in the square, already dead, but somehow I could still see, and I saw you go up the tower. I saw you look down. I saw you take a step forward and disappear." Emily sat down next to him on the piano bench. The space between them was small, but she could feel the warmth emanating from his body. She could feel something else too, a pulsation that wasn't physical, a connection that transcended everything she knew. "Why did you do it?" he asked. And he wasn't talking to Emily Carter, the housekeeper. He was talking to someone who had lived 200 years ago. "Why did you jump?" "Because I promised you," she replied. And again the words came from somewhere that wasn't her conscious memory. "I promised I would sing that song in every life until I found you. But I couldn't stay in that life without you. Not after hearing the bells. Not after knowing you were gone. You should have waited. I waited. 200 years, remember? You're the one who took so long to find me." Richard let out something between a laugh and a sob. "You're right. I took too long. I spent this whole life listening to your music without knowing you were singing to me somewhere." Emily put her hand on his. The touch sent that same electric current she had felt on the first day, but now she understood what it was. It wasn't strangeness. It was familiarity. It was coming home after being lost for 200 years. "What do we do now?" she asked. Richard turned his hand over and interlaced his fingers with hers. "First, we find all the evidence. Then, we figure out how this connection works. And then, maybe, we live the life that was stolen from us the first time." If you're watching this far and felt something reading about this connection, something you can't explain, leave a comment. What would you do if you discovered you knew someone in another life? The next few days were an avalanche of discoveries. The first historian came back with information about the Blackwood family. He discovered that the current estate had been built in 1875, but that the original property dated back to 1780. The founders of the family fortune were merchants from England who had settled in New Orleans during the colonial period. But it was the second historian who brought the crucial information. In the archives of St. Michael's Church, he found records of an execution dated October 1820. A man named Michael, with no last name recorded, had been sentenced to death for bewitching the daughter of the governor. The charge was witchcraft. The method of execution, hanging. The record mentioned that the condemned man was blind from birth and composed music considered heretical. It also mentioned that the governor's daughter, a woman named Isabella, had thrown herself from the mansion tower at the exact moment the bells announced the execution. 2 deaths, 2 souls lost in the same instant. 2 promises made in the dark of a cell on the last night. Richard read the report 3 times. Each word was a confirmation of what he already knew in his heart. Each detail fit perfectly into the fragmented memories that had surfaced in his dreams since childhood. But he needed more. The art expert was the one who found the next piece of the puzzle. The portrait in the basement was authenticated as a work from 1818, painted by a colonial artist whose name had been lost to time. The analysis of the paint, the canvas, and the technique confirmed that the painting was exactly 205 years old. And more importantly, the expert found an inscription on the back of the frame, hidden by layers of fabric and glue. An inscription that said, simply, "Michael and Isabella. May this love live beyond death." When Richard showed the inscription to Emily, she wasn't surprised. She already knew. Deep down, she had always known. The name Isabella wasn't foreign to her. It lived in some corner of her mind since she could remember, waiting to be remembered. The third researcher, a genealogist specializing in colonial families, brought the most shocking information of all. The governor's daughter, Isabella, had left behind a daughter of only a few months old when she died. The child was raised in secret, away from society, to avoid the scandal. That child grew up, got married, and had children. Her descendants, through generations and generations, eventually mixed with other American families, and one of those lines of descent led directly to the Blackwood family. Richard was a descendant of Isabella. The blood of the woman who loved the blind composer ran in his veins. He was, in a way, the product of that forbidden love, born from a child that Isabella had left behind before jumping from the tower. But that wasn't all. The genealogist had also traced the blind composer. Michael, it turned out, wasn't completely without family. He had a sister who survived the execution and who fled to the countryside, changing her name to escape persecution. That sister had descendants, and one of those lines of descent, passing through generations of poverty and anonymity, eventually produced a child who was abandoned at the door of Grimshaw Orphanage 28 years ago. Emily Carter carried the blood of Michael. She was a descendant of the blind composer, just as Richard was a descendant of the princess who loved him 200 years ago. They had been lovers from different worlds, united only by music and forbidden love. And now, 200 years later. Their descendants had met again, not as lovers from a past life, but as two human beings whose ancestors had made a promise that transcended death itself. The question was, were they really Michael and Isabella reincarnated? Or were they simply descendants carrying a genetic memory so strong that it manifested in dreams and music? Richard didn't know the answer, and honestly, he was starting to realize that maybe it didn't matter, because regardless of whether they were literal reincarnations or just genetic echoes of an ancient love, the connection between him and Emily was real. The recognition was real. The music she sang and that he heard in dreams was real, and the decision they needed to make was equally real. Emily was in the library of the Blackwood estate when Richard found her. She was looking out the window, lost in thoughts that probably involved towers, bells, and endless falls. "The reports confirmed everything," he said, approaching her. "I know," she replied without turning around. "I read the copies you left in my room. And what do you think?" Emily finally turned around. Her eyes were tired, but there was something else in them too. A determination he hadn't seen before. "I think I've spent 28 years singing a song to a dead man," she said. "I think you've spent 38 years listening to a song from a woman who jumped from a tower. I think that, in some way that science can't explain, we've found each other again." Richard took a step toward her. "And now, I don't know." She shook her head. "I'm your housekeeper, Richard. You're a billionaire. The difference between us is as great as the difference between a blind composer and the governor's daughter. You're wrong." Another step. He was close now, close enough to see the tears she was fighting to hold back. The difference between Michael and Isabella was that he couldn't see her, but he knew her better than anyone with perfect eyes. "The difference between us is that I can see you, Emily. I can see the real you, not the uniform you wear, not the bank account you don't have. You. The woman who carries my music in her soul for 200 years. Richard raised his hand and touched her face. Emily closed her eyes at the contact. "I don't care what people will think," he continued. "I don't care about the scandal. I don't care about any of that. I spent 3 years living like a dead man after my wife was gone. I thought I'd never feel anything again. And then you appeared singing an impossible song. And suddenly, I was alive again." "Richard," she whispered. "I lost you once because of the rules of the world," he said. "I'm not going to lose you again." And then he kissed her. It wasn't a shy kiss, it wasn't a polite kiss. It was a kiss born from 200 years of longing, 200 years of waiting, 200 years of promises whispered in the dark and dreamed in solitude. When they broke apart, both were breathless, utterly breathless. "And now?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "Just a little. Now, you're going to show me if that melody has lyrics," Richard replied, his voice full of hope. "Because I've been hearing it in my dreams for 33 years. But I've never heard anyone sing the words." Emily smiled through her tears, such happy tears. "It has lyrics," she said, her voice a song in itself. "I know every word. I've always known, ever since I was born." "Then sing it to me," he practically begged, "as you promised you would sing in every life." And there, in the library of the Blackwood estate, a mansion built upon the ruins of an age-old love, Emily Carter began to sing, her voice clear and strong, not just the haunting melody she had always hummed. This time, she sang the words, deep, resonant words in Old Spanish, a language she had never learned, and yet knew by heart. Words of love and farewell, words of promise and unwavering hope, words that a blind composer had written for his forbidden princess 2 centuries ago. And Richard, for the first time in his life, heard the music in its entirety, the music of his dreams. The music he had searched for in every corner of the world, never finding it. It was there. In the voice of an orphaned housekeeper he had known for 2 weeks and 2 centuries, all at once. And it was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. Ever. Some things deserve a pause, a moment to just breathe. If you're feeling something right now, something you can't quite explain, know that you're not alone. Millions of people around the world report inexplicable connections, melodies that appear from nowhere, faces that feel familiar for absolutely no reason. Maybe this story is stirring something within you. If it is, we'll keep watching. Because what comes next and changed everything for Richard and Emily. That night, after Emily finished singing, Richard led her back down to the basement. He had an idea, a bold idea, an idea that could prove, once and for all, that the connection between them was more than just genetic coincidence, more than just a crazy whim. "The piano," he said, pointing to the antique instrument that still waited patiently in the center of the room. "You said you never learned to play." "Never," Emily confirmed, shaking her head. "I barely had access to musical instruments at Grimshaw Orphanage, and when I did, they were old guitars with missing strings. I've never played a piano in my life." Richard gently guided her to the bench in front of the instrument. "Sit down," he asked, his voice soft and reassuring. Emily hesitated, her hands trembling. "Why? I just told you I don't know how to play." "Trust me," he said, his blue eyes holding hers. She sat, staring at the yellowed keys as if they were alien artifacts. Her hands rested in her lap, unsure of what to do, utterly clueless. Richard picked up the silk scarf he had used the night before. He turned to Emily and asked, "Do you trust me?" Emily looked into his eyes. Really looked. "Yes," she said, and the word came, laden with 200 years of absolute certainty. He placed the scarf over her eyes, gently tying it. The world went dark. Emily felt her heart race. Her other senses sharpened to compensate for the lack of sight. She could smell the old wood and damp earth, the rich aroma of old age. She could hear Richard's breath beside her, close, warm, and steady. She could feel the presence of the piano before her, almost like a magnetic force, pulling her in. "Now," Richard said softly, barely above a whisper, "place your hands on the keys." Emily raised her hands, trembling and ever so slightly. They found the keyboard by instinct, positioning themselves over notes she didn't know. Yet her fingers seemed to remember. "Don't think," Richard instructed, his voice a calming presence. "Don't try to play, just let your hands do what they want." Emily took a deep breath. This was insane, she knew that. She didn't know how to play the piano. She had never touched a piano. There was absolutely no way her fingers could possibly know what to do. But then, something happened. Her fingers moved. It wasn't her commanding them. It was something older, something deeper, something that resided in a place beyond conscious memory. Her fingers pressed keys, created chords, wove melodies. Beautiful, heartbreaking melodies. And the music that emerged was the music. The music, their music. The music she had been singing since she was born. But now, instead of coming from her voice, it was flowing from the piano, flowing from her hands. Complete, perfect, with harmonies and counterpoints she didn't even know existed. Emily began to cry beneath the blindfold. Tears streamed down her face. Her hands continued to play, independent of her will, performing an 8-minute piece she had never learned, that she had never seen written down, that existed only in her soul and in the dreams of a man who had been searching for her for decades. When the last note dissolved into the air of the basement, Emily pulled off. The blindfold with trembling hands, Richard was kneeling beside the bench, tears streaming freely down his face, a look of pure awe on his face. "You played," he said, his voice thick with emotion, choked with feeling. "You played the entire piece, every note, every variation, exactly as it's written in the 1820 score. Emily stared at her own hands as if they belonged to someone else, someone unknown. "How?" she whispered, barely audible. "How did I do that?" Richard took her hands in his touch gentle. "Because it wasn't you playing," he said, his voice now barely a whisper. "It was her. Isabella. She's in you. Emily. Just as Miguel is in me. We are them. We always have been." "But how is that even possible? Science doesn't explain this. Nothing explains this," Emily said, desperately trying to grasp hold of any explanation. Richard stood and walked to the table where the research documents lay. There was something there he hadn't yet shown her. One last discovery the genealogist had made, but he had been saving it for this moment. A moment like this. "Read this," he said, handing her a yellowed piece of paper. Emily took the document with hands still shaking. It was a letter, written in Old Spanish, dated 3 days before Miguel's execution. She read aloud, translating mentally as she went. "Mi amada Isabella, when you read this letter, I will already be gone. But do not fear. Death is not the end for us. I have made a promise, not just to you, but to the universe itself. I will find you again. No matter how many lifetimes it takes, no matter in what bodies we are reborn, I will always recognize your voice, and you will always recognize my music." The ink blurred as Emily continued reading through her tears. "There is an ancient ritual I learned from the mountain Indians before I lost my sight. They believe that soulmates can find each other across lifetimes if they leave an anchor, something that transcends death, something that survives time. For us, that anchor is the music, the song I composed for you. As long as it exists, we will exist. And when we meet again, the music will be the proof. You will sing it without knowing why. I will hear it without knowing where it comes from. And when we are finally together, when we finally play it on the same instrument on which it was composed, the cycle will be complete." Emily stopped reading. Her hands trembled so violently, the paper almost slipped from her grasp. "He knew," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Miguel knew this was going to happen. He planned it all. The music isn't just a song. It's a ritual, a magic, a way to guarantee that we would find each other again." Richard nodded slowly. The genealogist. He found this letter in a church archive. It was tucked away with Michael's belongings, items seized before his execution. No one knew what it meant until now. Emily gazed at the piano, at the portrait, at Richard. "We just completed the ritual," she said. "I sang, you listened, and now I've played the melody on the very piano where it was composed 200 years ago." Richard approached her. The air between them seemed charged with electricity, with possibility, with something that transcended rational explanation. "What happens now?" Emily asked. And then, as if the universe itself was answering her question, something extraordinary occurred. Boom. The basement began to glow. It wasn't electric light. It wasn't the dim bulbs flickering. It was something, choice different, a golden luminosity that seemed to emanate from the air itself, from the walls, from the piano, from them. Emily and Richard looked at each other, startled, but not afraid. It was as if, deep down, they knew that this was part of the process, part of the ritual that Michael had begun 2 centuries ago. And then, the visions began. They weren't dreams. They weren't fragmented memories. They were complete images, vivid, as real as the basement around them. Emily saw. She saw a secret garden behind a grand southern mansion. She saw a woman in an elaborate gown sitting on a stone bench. She saw a blind man seated before her, his hands on a small upright piano, playing a haunting melody, an age-old tune she knew, better than her own name. She saw them kissing, hidden from prying eyes. She saw love letters being passed through loyal servants. She saw entire nights filled with music and whispered promises while the world slept. And then she saw the horror. She saw guards storming the garden. She saw the blind man being dragged away, shouting her name. She saw the woman being restrained, begging for mercy. She saw a dark cell where they met for the last time, separated by iron bars, their hands touching through the cold metal. She saw the promise being made. She heard the words that she herself had spoken 200 years ago in another life. I will sing this melody in every life until I find you again, and I will hear it, he replied, in every life, in every form, in every moment, until I recognize you. The vision shifted. Now it was the town square, the scorching sun, the crowd, shouting insults at a man condemned for treason and forbidden love, the noose being placed, the blindfolded eyes that didn't need to see, to know that she was there, somewhere, weeping for him. And then, the drop, the snap, the silence, and in a distant tower, a woman who couldn't bear the weight of that silence. Emily saw herself atop the tower. She saw the wind. She saw the ground far below. She saw the church bells still tolling, and she saw the decision being made. It wasn't despair. It was a promise. It was certainty. It was the beginning of a search that would last 200 years. The fall, the wind, the end. That was only the beginning. The visions stopped as abruptly as they had begun. Emily and Richard were back in the basement, the golden light gradually fading, leaving only the dim bulbs and the heavy silence. They looked at each other. They weren't just Emily and Richard anymore. They were also Isabella and Michael. Two souls in two bodies, finally reunited after 2 centuries of searching. I remember, Emily said, and her voice was different now, stronger, older. I remember everything, the garden, the nights, the promise, the fall. I do too, Richard said. I remember every note I composed for you. I remember the scent of your hair. I remember the way your hands touched my face so that I could see you, without eyes. They embraced, not as employer and housekeeper, not as 2 strangers who had known each other for 2 weeks, but as 2 souls who had waited 200 years for that moment. And when they separated, when they could finally look at each other without the veil of past lives and ancient promises, there was a question hanging between them. And now? Emily asked. What do we do with this? Richard smiled. It was the smile of a man who had finally found his purpose. Now, he said, we live the life that was stolen from us. We live the love that was interrupted. We live every moment as if it were both the first and the last. But what about the world, the people, the difference between us? Richard cupped her face in his hands. The world tried to tear us apart in 1820, and it failed. They killed us, and yet we're here together 200 years later. Do you really think anything can separate us now? Emily let out a laugh. That was also a sob. When you put it that way, Mo, she said, because it was true. They had conquered death. They had conquered time. They had conquered everything. The universe had thrown against them. What was a little social prejudice key compared to 200 years of separation? But before they could make plans for the future, the present brought an emergency. Emily's phone, which she had left in the back room, was ringing insistently. She rushed up from the basement, followed by Richard, her heart tight with a terrible premonition. It was the hospital. Ethan, her little brother, had taken a turn for the worse. The leukemia was progressing faster than the doctors had expected. They needed a bone marrow transplant done urgently, but there were no compatible donors on the waiting list. Emily collapsed. Everything that had happened, all the revelations, all the promises of past lives, none of it mattered. If she lost Ethan, he was the only family she had in this life. The only reason she fought so hard, worked so many hours, accepted any humiliation. Richard held her as she wept. He didn't say anything. There were no words that could console such pain. But there was something he could do. The next morning, Emily woke up at the hospital beside Ethan's bed. She had spent the night there, holding the boy's hand as he slept, connected to machines that kept his weak body functioning. Richard entered the room quietly. He carried papers in his hands, and there was something in his eyes that Emily couldn't identify. "I made some calls," he said, sitting down beside her. "My family has connections with the best hospitals in the United States. We found a bone marrow transplant specialist who works with an international donor bank." Emily looked at him, uncomprehendingly. "That's incredible." "But the doctors said there are no compatible donors." Richard smiled. "That's where it gets interesting," he said. "The specialist ran some tests and discovered something extraordinary." "What?" Richard took her hand. "Remember what the genealogist discovered, that you're a descendant of Michael, and I'm a descendant of Isabella?" Emily nodded, not understanding where he was going with this. "Isabella and Miguel, they came from different worlds," Richard continued. "She was the daughter of the Spanish viceroy. He was of mixed heritage, a blend of Spanish and indigenous blood. But Isabella's daughter, the child she left behind, the father wasn't her official fiancé." Emily's eyes widened. "Are you saying Dua?" "The father was Miguel," Richard confirmed. "Isabella was pregnant with Miguel when he was executed. The child she left behind was their daughter, which means that both your lineage and mine stem from the same ancestors, Isabella and Miguel." "We're related?" Emily asked, incredulous. "Very, very distantly related," Richard clarified. 200 years and dozens of generations removed, but we share a minimal percentage of DNA. And that percentage is exactly what makes... Emily understood before he finished. "Ethan," she whispered. "You might be a match for Ethan." Richard nodded solemnly. "I've already been tested. The specialist confirmed it an hour ago. I'm a perfect donor." Emily was stunned into silence. What was he saying? That after everything, after past lives, ancient rituals, promises transcending death, the solution to saving her little brother lay in the DNA they shared, because of a love from 2 centuries ago? It was impossible. It was absurd. It was the kind of coincidence that never happened in real life, but it was happening. "You'd do it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You'd donate your marrow to Ethan?" Richard looked at her as if the question itself was offensive. "Emily," he said softly, That boy is the only blood relative you have in this life, your only connection to your history, to who you are. Do you really think I'd let anything happen to him? But the surgery is risky. You could have complications, you could. Richard stopped her with a kiss, a gentle kiss, full of promises. I already died for you once, he said when they parted. You think I'm afraid of a needle? And for the first time in days, Emily laughed, a genuine laugh, full of relief and hope, and something she'd almost forgotten how to feel: happiness. The transplant was scheduled for the following week. During those waiting days, Richard and Emily prepared together. He underwent all the necessary tests, while she cared for Ethan, singing to him every night. Not the haunting melody, the age-old tune, but lullabies she made up on the spot, filled with promises of healing and a bright future. Ethan, despite his weakness, seemed to sense that something good was coming. He would smile when he saw Richard enter the room. The two had formed an ODD connection, as if the 8-year-old knew, somehow instinctively, that this man was important. You're my sister's boyfriend, Ethan asked one day, his voice weak but his eyes sparkling with curiosity. Richard looked at Emily, who blushed deeply. Yes, he said simply, I am. You'll take care of her? Ethan insisted. Even when I'm not sick anymore and I can take care of her myself? Richard knelt beside the boy's bed, bringing himself level with his gaze. I promise, he said solemnly. I promise to take care of her, in every life, no matter how long it takes, no matter what happens. Ethan smiled, satisfied with an answer he probably didn't fully understand. Okay, he said, then you can be her boyfriend. Emily and Richard exchanged a look that spoke volumes, more than words ever could. The day of the transplant arrived. Richard was prepped for surgery while Emily waited in the family waiting room. She couldn't stop pacing, her hands twisting the hem of her shirt, her eyes glued to the door leading to the operating room, and as she waited, she hummed, softly, almost unconsciously, the haunting melody, the age-old tune, the music that connected her to Richard across time and death. The surgery lasted 4 hours. 4 hours in which Emily lived every second as if it were an eternity. 4 hours in which she prayed to every god she knew, and some she made up on the spot. 4 hours in which she promised everything she had, and everything she didn't have, in exchange for the lives of 2 people she loved. When the doctor finally emerged from the operating room, Emily almost collapsed. It all went well, he said, and those 3 words were the most beautiful she'd ever heard. The donation was a success. Now we need to wait for the marrow to take in Ethan's system. And Richard? How is he? The doctor smiled. Sleeping. He should wake up in a few hours. He's stable. Emily allowed herself to cry. Tears of relief, of gratitude, of emotional exhaustion. She cried for everything that had happened in the last few weeks, for the impossible encounter, for the revelations that had turned her world upside down, for Ethan's illness, for the generosity of a man she'd known for so little time, and so much time all at once. She cried for Miguel and Isabella, who never had this chance, who died young, separated, with promises that would only be fulfilled 200 years later, and she cried with happiness, because finally, after centuries of waiting, the story was having a different ending. The following weeks were filled with waiting and hope. Richard recovered quickly from the donation, his strength and determination overcoming any physical discomfort. He visited Ethan every day, sitting by the boy's bedside, telling stories and making promises of adventures they would have when he got better. Emily watched the 2 of them, her heart overflowing with something she never thought she'd feel. A family. A complete family. Improbable. Built on 200-year-old promises and connections that science couldn't explain. 3 weeks after the transplant, The doctors delivered the news everyone had been waiting for. The marrow had taken. Ethan was in remission. The 8-year-old boy who had been knocking on death's door was winning the battle. When Emily received the news, she couldn't contain her emotion. She fell into Richard's arm and wept, not knowing if the tears were of joy, of relief, or of gratitude for everything that had happened. "Thank you," she said between sobs. "Thank you for saving my brother. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for every promise you've made and are keeping." Richard held her tighter. "I waited 200 years for you," but he said. "You think I was going to let anything make you suffer now that we're finally together?" In the months that followed, Emily and Richard's lives transformed completely. Richard publicly announced his relationship with Emily, ignoring the whispers and disapproving glances from New Orleans high society. Some gossip columns ran malicious headlines about the millionaire who had fallen for the housekeeper. Some former business associates cut ties. The invitations to some social events began to dwindle. Richard Blackwood paid it absolutely no mind. "When you've spent 200 years searching for someone," he told a reporter who dared to ask about the developing scandal, "you quickly realize that the opinions of people who'll be dead in a few decades hold absolutely no value." The reporter didn't quite understand, but he printed it anyway, and somehow that enigmatic quote captured the public's imagination. The story of Richard and Emily, the millionaire and the orphaned housekeeper, spread like wildfire. Of course, no one truly believed the past life nonsense. No one bought into the impossible music, or the shared visions, or the 200-year-old ritual. But everyone believed in the love that transcended social barriers, and that, in itself, was a story people desperately wanted to hear. Emily officially moved into the Blackwood estate, no longer as a housekeeper, but as the owner of half of everything. Richard insisted on putting her name on every property, every account, every single document. "What's mine is yours," he'd say. "It always has been." Since 1820, Ethan made a complete recovery. The boy, who'd once stood at death's door, now ran through the estate gardens, his laughter echoing through the ancient halls. He adopted Richard as a father figure, following him everywhere, asking endless questions about business and cars and all the things 8-year-old boys find fascinating. And on an October evening, exactly 1 year after their first meeting, Richard asked the question that Emily had been waiting for since she remembered who she truly was. They were in the cellar, before the 1820 piano, the very place where everything had been revealed, the very place where their souls finally recognized each other. Richard knelt down. "Emily, Isabella, my princess who sings in the darkness," he said, his voice trembling. For the first time since she'd known him. "I lost you once. I've spent 200 years searching for you. And now that I've found you, I want to spend the rest of this life and every life to come by your side." He opened a velvet box. Inside, gleaming under the dim cellar light, was a ring. But it wasn't just any ring. It was the ring from the portrait, the very same ring that Isabella wore in the 1818 painting, the same ring that the genealogist had tracked through auctions and private collections until Richard finally managed to buy it back. "This ring once belonged to you," Richard said. "I'd like it to belong to you again. Forever. This time." Emily looked at the ring, at Richard, at the piano that had carried their music. For 200 years, tears streamed down her face. But she was smiling. "Yes," she said, "in every life. Yes." Richard slipped the ring on her finger. The fit was perfect, as if the ring had never stopped being hers. And then, in that cellar, built upon the ruins of an ancient love, they kissed, not as Emily and Richard, as Isabella and Miguel, as two souls who had finally completed a 200-year cycle. The wedding took place 3 months later. It was a simple ceremony, unlike anything society expected from a man of Richard's position, just close family and true friends. Ethan was the ring bearer, his huge smile lighting up the entire church. The reception was at the estate, of course, in the garden. That had once been a secret garden where two lovers met, hidden from the world, and at the end of the night, when the guests had all left and the estate was silent, Emily and Richard went down to the cellar for the last time. As single people, the piano awaited them. As always, Emily sat down before the yellowed keys. Richard stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder. And then she played. She didn't need the blindfold anymore. The music was completely integrated within her. Now, each note flowed from her fingers as if she'd always known how to play them, because, in a way, she always had. Richard began to sing along. He'd also learned the lyrics, the same lyrics in Old Spanish that Emily had known since birth. Their voices mingled, harmonious, complementary, exactly as they were planned to be, and as they sang, something magical happened. The golden light returned, softer, this time not as intense as the first time, but present, real, a confirmation that the ritual was complete, that the promises had been kept, that two souls who were lost 200 years ago were finally at peace. When the music ended, the light dissipated slowly. Richard and Emily looked at each other. There were tears in both their eyes, but they were tears of completeness, of finalization, of a cycle that had finally closed. "It's over," Emily said softly. "The wait is over." Richard smiled. "Actually," he said, "it's only just beginning. We have a lifetime ahead of us, and if we're lucky, many lifetimes after that." Emily laughed. "If we're lucky," she agreed. "But even if we only have this one, it'll be enough. Because finally, after 200 years, we're together." And it was true. In the years that followed, Richard and Emily built a life that would be envied by anyone, but that, for them, was simply the natural result of finding their soulmate. Richard expanded his hotel business, but with a new philosophy. Every hotel now had a piano in its lobby, and musicians were hired to play ancient melodies, preserving the art that had almost been lost to time. Emily discovered a talent for composition, the music that she'd carried in her soul her entire life became the starting point for dozens of new works. She never studied music formally, but she didn't need to. The compositions simply poured out, as if they'd been waiting inside her. All along, Ethan grew up, surrounded by love. The boy, who'd once been an orphan, now had a complete family. He developed his own love for music, and at 16, he already played the piano almost as well as Emily, and the Blackwood estate, built upon the ruins of an ancient love, became a place of joy instead of sorrow. The halls that once echoed only with solitary footsteps were now filled with laughter, music, and life. The cellar was transformed into a small museum. The 1820 piano, the portrait of Miguel and Isabella, the original sheet music, the letter, the ring, all the artifacts. That proved a story that most people would find impossible to believe. Emily and Richard didn't try to convince anyone. They didn't need external validation. They knew what they'd lived. They knew what they'd seen, and that was enough. But sometimes, when skeptical visitors entered the museum and heard the story, something strange happened. Some would cry without knowing why. Others recounted feelings of familiarity, of recognition, of something they couldn't quite put their finger on. And some, the more sensitive souls, swore they could hear a faint melody in the air. Even when no one was playing the piano, Emily would smile when this happened. Perhaps, she thought, we're not the only ones. Maybe there are other souls out there, searching for each other across lifetimes, waiting for a sign, a song, a moment of recognition, and maybe, just maybe, telling this story could help some of those souls find each other a little faster. On an October night, exactly 10 years after their first meeting, Emily woke up in the middle of the night. Richard was asleep beside her, his breathing soft and even. She gazed at him for a long moment, the face she had known 200 years ago and 10 years ago, all at the same time, the man who had traversed lifetimes to find her, the love that had withstood death, time, and all the barriers the universe had thrown between them, as if sensing her gaze. Richard opened his eyes. "What is it?" he murmured, still half asleep. "Nothing," Emily replied, smiling. "I was just thinking." "About what?" "About how lucky I am to have you, to have Ethan, to have all of this." Richard pulled her closer. "It wasn't luck," he said. "It was destiny, planned 200 years ago by a blind composer who loved too much to let death be the end." Emily laid her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. A heart that had beaten for her in 1820, and was still beating now. "Richard," she said softly. "Yes? Do you think we'll find each other again? In the next life?" Richard thought for a moment. "I'm sure of it," he said finally. "The music still exists. The promise still holds. And I'll look for you in every life, no matter how long it takes, until I find you again." Emily smiled in the dark. "Until you find me again," she repeated. And then, in silence, she began to hum. The same melody as always, the same impossible song, the tune that connected her to him across time and death. Richard listened, as he had listened in dreams throughout his life before finding her. He listened and knew, with a certainty that transcended rational explanations, that no matter what happened, no matter how many lives passed, he would always find her, because some connections are stronger than death, some promises survive the centuries, and some songs, once composed with true love, never stop playing. This is the story of Richard and Emily, of Miguel and Isabella, of two souls who were lost 200 years ago and finally found each other, guided by a song that never should have existed, but that, somehow, always did. It's a story about love that transcends social classes and impossible barriers, about promises made in the darkness of a prison cell and fulfilled in the cellar of a centuries-old estate, about music that carries memories through generations, about destiny that refuses to be denied, and perhaps, above all else, it's a story about hope. Hope that inexplicable connections mean something, that feeling of knowing someone you've just met isn't just your imagination, that true love, when it's truly true, finds a way back, always. If you've made it this far, I need to ask you a question. Have you ever had a song stuck in your head that you didn't know where it came from? Have you ever felt an instant connection with someone you just met? Have you ever dreamed of places you've never visited, faces you've never seen, moments you've never lived? If the answer is yes, maybe you are also looking for someone. Or maybe someone is looking for you. And maybe, just maybe, This story is the sign you needed to keep searching, because 200 years is a long time to wait. But when you finally find what you're looking for, every second of the wait is worth it. Emily and Richard know that now. Miguel and Isabella always knew. And you can find out too. Just keep listening. Keep singing. Keep believing. Because the right music, sung to the right person, can cross any distance and any time, any life. And when it finally reaches the right ears, when it finally finds the soul that recognizes it, the world will seem like a completely different place. A place where 200 years of waiting makes sense. A place where promises made in the darkness are fulfilled in the light. A place where love, when it's true, simply refuses to end. And maybe that's what we're all looking for, deep down. Not just someone to love, but someone who makes us believe that love can last forever. Emily found that in Richard. Isabella found that in Miguel. And somewhere out there, maybe you are about to find it too. Just keep your ears open and your heart willing, because the music that could change your life might already be playing. You just need to recognize it.